I'm Grace Cavalieri. This is The Poet and the Poem from the Library of Congress, and now we're featuring Judith Farr, poet, novelist, biographer, scholar. She is the foremost Emily Dickinson scholar and Elinor Wylie scholar and biographer. But first, we're going to hear a poem.
This is a poem that I wrote for Marianne Moore. It's called Loss, and it was inspired by a line from the Washington Post in October 20th, 2004. Many bird populations are in decline, data show. The greater prairie chicken is doing poorly. Here is the poem. Loss. If such news had been of nightingales, the lark, swan, dove, or bluebird, tears would have sprung to my eyes, while a dozen hallowed poems sang in my heart of tenderness, elegance, romance. As it is, the fate of the prairie chicken seems less disquieting. Bundling across the arid landscape in sullen brown, his rotundity a discouragement to flight, this prisoner of the desert, striped and shrill, lacks every glamour, while what commends him is mere enterprise. Should prairie chickens disappear, though, we would lose a worthy homeliness, an awkward plainness, a shabby industry that make beauty and ease all the more remarkable by contrast. I find myself looking again at him, recognizing the world and me.
That is the voice of Judith Farr. First, about Marianne Moore. She has been a big factor in your life. Tell the world who she was.
Well, she was a great American poet to begin with, one of the first early 20th century American women poets, and recognized as such during her lifetime. She was gallant. She was impeccably scholarly. Mm-hmm. She actually took a job as a librarian to enable her to write poetry quietly at home with her mother. She believed in literature, but she was also of something of a scientific bent, so she used to like to write poems about, whales, porpoises.
She discovered you in a way.
Well, yes, I was a little girl, really, in love with language, 14 years old, in Manhattan, where I grew up. My father was a symphony musician, and my mother was very artistic, but both read greatly, and I fell in love with poetry. And there was a contest in New York City. It was funny. It was, I think, sponsored by the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and the prize in the contest was if your poem won and you were a girl, you were able to have dinner with Marianne Moore. If you were a boy, you had dinner with Alan Swallow. So just for a lark, I sent in a poem, and I did win.
The Riverside Anthology. And she presented you the award.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did. And then
Your first publication.
That poem was my first publication, yes. Mm-hmm. Then a little bit after, I had a little poem in 17, which didn't sound like me. It sounded a little bit like Edna Millay and a little bit like
we all
D.S.
did in the beginning. and so she took you under her wing in a way.
She did. Yes, she carted me around to a dinner, I remember. It was a Penn dinner with Marilyn Monroe, who was newly married to Joe DiMaggio. And I remember Marianne saying, which was funny, she had a wonderful sense of humor. She said, if I went to my beautician every day, I could look like that. Meaning Marilyn Monroe, who really did look pretty striking, I can tell you. But yes, she was wonderful to me. And of course, she did give me some advice about writing, more than some. I still remember, although it's so many years ago now, but the first thing she said was, you must find your own voice. And the poems that you're writing now sound a little bit like different people, whomever it is that you're reading at the time, which was of course true. And she said, so I want you to try to find what you think is your own voice. And then she said, since she asked me, she said, who is your favorite poet? And being tremendously stupid, I said, Emily Dickinson. Of course, I could have said you know, but it didn't occur to me. It wouldn't really have been true. I admired her immensely, but I was in love with Emily. So that was what I said. And then, of course, she said, "Oh, that's bad." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because she'll devour you."
And
she is so great.
has.
She will devour you, meaning I might never find my own voice.
Well, that's not true. You have found your own voice as a novelist, and that novel, I Never Came to You in White. You have found your own voice in many biographies. The Passion of Emily Dickinson is the zenith work on her life. Harvard University Press. The Life and Art of Elinor Wylie was the first biography on her, I think, ever.
Yes.
Yes. And, of course,
First long one.
the latest book, The Gardens of Emily Dickinson, Harvard University Press, was awarded the Rose Mary Crawshay Prize of the Keats and Shelley Memorial Trust of the British Academy in 2005. Did you go over there?
Oh, we did. It was a great treat.
Oh, gosh.
They had a lovely prize-giving ceremony and read out a long account of the book. And my darling son came. His wife allowed him. He's a lawyer, but she forgave him the trip. She had to work, and we went over as a family, and the British were wonderful to me. I was the first American ever to get this award.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Since 1888. It was established in 1888 for the best book by a woman on some literary topic. And, the British love Emily Dickinson.
Well,
and, of course, they love their gardens. So I think the fact that it was on flowers had something to do with the award.
You have done more for Emily than she could have known. But you do have your own voice also, and so you're going to let us hear that now. This is Judith Farr, who is biographer, poet, novelist.
I do have a poem for Emily Dickinson, the only one I've written for her. This was written in 1971, and it's titled Remembering 28th August, 1971, when the United States Post Office issued a stamp honoring Emily Dickinson. She was the queen recluse. In later years, her sister addressed her envelopes. Within a white shroud, the fine reticence endured. She wrote a taut hand, all wildness chiseled in an alphabet few housewives understood. A letter from Emily, whatever could it mean? Season's passage, passion bonneted or frank, memorials to absent friends. Emily of the upper stair, of the unseen window, fragrant with hyacinth. What would I have given for your letters? The conundrums of an eccentric spinster, the flood tides of the aesthetic mind. She distrusted photographs. At 17, her father made her sit for one. The quick ran from it, she said, right away. Her images were mental. She had a sister-in-law who loved publicity. Urgent, gentle, she lavished rhymes upon her, proving how above repute is genius. Nonetheless, some Dickinsons respected fame. If fame belonged to me, she countered sadly, I could not escape her. Indeed. Now for the frigid garden, the unstinting room, here for the cherished silence and the lonely doom, we pay tribute. In the Billings Post Office in upstate New York, the old postmistress shares the stamps out. I read Emily Dickinson, she laughs, in school. They told us she was mad. Imagine. The day is further from summer than the birds, autumnal, elegiac. I pay and go. Oh, Emily, evanescent, light-spun, stern, how you would, or would you, stare to see yourself a plated person in my hand. You who relished ironies, opposites, the mail from Tunis or downstairs. Miss Dickinson of Amherst, and of Air.
Oh, beautiful. That is Judith Farr on Emily Dickinson. So that was written in the 70s, and then in the 90s you went on to bring her to life in the most emphatic work about her life, I think, that exists. And that, The Passion of Emily Dickinson. Now that title alone speaks absolutely from it's a heart connection with you.
Oh, yes.
So when you started, did you start with this passion? Tell me the very first thing you said. You woke up in the morning and said, I'm going to put together everything I know and start working on Emily. What was the first thing you had to do?
Well, I think I had to think more deeply than I had thought over the years about her relationship to her family and to other works of literature. It sounds like what anyone would do, but I had already written so much about her, many articles, many essays. I was not confident that people understood, or that it had been understood, what really moved her, what made her write. There was this mysterious master. I felt that through my work in American painting, I came to understand who the master was, who this man actually was. Many people had said it was Samuel Bowles, the editor of the Springfield Republican, to whom she wrote the most moving letters. And I decided that they were right, that this was indeed the case, but I had much additional proof. And I also had an understanding of how her sister-in-law affected her and what made her begin to write with so many poems, hundreds of them, starting in about 1861. She had played with poetry through the 1850s, but it was in 1861.
How long did it take you to travel her road?
Well, many years. Really, it was almost the work of a lifetime when I did it, because I had already done many, as I say, many essays, but this was a very long book.
Did you ever think, I am lost in Emily, where do I go? Or did you just have the stamina of a long-distance runner and just every day, how does the biographer get to the end?
I don't really know. Some people say they never do. And actually, I'm working now on a novel about the women in the family of Robert E. Lee. And it seems like a strange departure, but he's also a 19th century figure, a descendant. My husband is a descendant of the Lees, and I became very interested in Mrs. Lee and the daughters and how they suffered.
What a contribution!
Well, the way they suffered through the Civil War was simply unbelievable. I mean, it was so painful. The loss of Arlington.
If women will not write this, who will write this?
Well, that's sort of what I think. And of course, the same thing has happened to me with the Lees as happened with Emily. I became fascinated with indeed, the passion of their lives, and by this I mean passio, suffering, as well as the suffering of her life, as well as the loves in her life.
Just to place you in history, I believe you were among the first women to be in the Yale Graduate School ever.
Well, I think I was among the first, but I was definitely the first woman teacher in a few places. Oh, dear.
So pioneering is not new to you, but I don't want us to get lost in history and lose you. Okay. So we want to hear one more poem, and then I have many, many questions.
This is a poem that I wrote for another literary figure, but Emily Dickinson adored this figure, so in a way there's a connection. And this is Emily Bronte. Emily Bronte at my prep school. She always sat behind me, so I hoped she'd give me answers. But when a teacher ordered conjugate, she murmured, dream. When the blackboard shouted syntax, she whispered, passion. Her uniform was full of holes. A lilac-colored slip drooped below the hem. Concealed within her Thoreau's Walden, she kept a copy of Don Juan. Laughing softly to herself, she'd mouth a line or two. One day, the teacher noticed. Stand up before the class, he snapped. Compare and contrast the structures of Wuthering Heights and Mansfield Park. She blanched. I'd rather not, she said. Suddenly, a window opened wide. 30 shining angels, visitants of air, flashed into the room around her. Come along with me, she beckoned as they bore her up aloft. Terrified, I stayed behind to keep myself quite safe. I still remember how, transfigured, her wild hair streamed among the stars.
Oh, I love the way you can occupy another great woman in history. Elinor Wylie, she was your first task. Now, all of us grew up with Edna St. Vincent Millay and Elinor Wylie in our generation. When I was researching the Poets Laureate of the United States for the Library of Congress, the women laureates had one thing in common, and that is that they were without ambition. That was the one difference I saw, that they really didn't feel they were entitled to ambition.
Really? Yes.
Except for Louise Bogan, maybe. But
Yes.
Elinor Wylie was not a laureate. But she did have a kind
Tremendous
of a subversive ambition.
Tremendous ambition. She left husbands for it and one child.
Yes.
And when my book came out, curiously, I remember a critic being quite, well, I thought offensive, because he would not have said this of a male figure. He said, how can Mrs. Farr claim that this is a fine writer, this woman, when she left her son and her first husband in order to be a writer? That wasn't quite true anyway. She left to elope with her second husband, but in the process, she was able to write much more than Philip Hitchborn, the first husband, might have allowed her to do. And of course, one would not have criticized Shelley's poetry on the basis of his behavior towards wives. So it was quite wrong. I know, however, that ambition, for instance, I don't know if I should mention this, it may make people unhappy, but Marianne Moore counseled me never to marry. She said, you must not marry, because if you marry, of course she was unmarried, she said, you will have to give up the passion that belongs to a poet, to a man, and to your children.
But you found that was not true.
Oh,
you found
no.
you had enough to go around.
Oh, yes.
Yes, you did.
And I would much rather, yes, I won't say I couldn't do without my husband and
absolutely,
child.
Absolutely. Elinor Wylie, though, was not popular, and so you really were breaking new ground with her. And her poetry was better than we thought.
Oh, it's very good.
It's very good. You said Theodore Redka was informed by it.
He was asked who has affected you most. He said, except for Shakespeare, Elinor Wylie.
You were her first champion.
In a way, because, her papers, you see, were at Yale. Her last husband, William Rose Benet, had left the manuscripts to the Yale Library, and I was a student then, early 60s, and I wanted to find something that was rare and special and new. I had already sort of done what I could at that time with Emily Dickinson with several essays, and so I decided to write a book about Elinor Wylie.
Was she your dissertation?
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
good.
she was.
And it became a book.
Yes.
And her poetry, I was just rereading it in light of you coming here today.
Oh, how nice.
It's better. It gets better and better with the years, which is very funny. Mm-hmm. And not all of the women of that time I can say that about.
No, that's very, very true. And if you look at an anthology like Louis Untermeyer's, as you know, Grace, some of them have just fallen right out of the canon. But not many. Curiously enough, not so many.
Well, let us hear another poem by Judith Farr.
Well, this is about a place. This is about the Bronte Parsonage. I brought it because of the other poem. And the Bronte Parsonage, of course, is in Haworth in England. Hard to believe that so much passion seeded and bloomed here in 3 frail girls. This tight, spare house, so prim and measured.